Welcome to the Frontlines of Leadership podcast, where my guests tell stories and share principles to inspire the rising generation of leaders. Today, I'm excited to welcome Joe Nabrotzky to the Frontlines of Leadership podcast. Joe provides transformational experiences to scale organizations and grow individuals, inspiring them to lead from the boardroom to the family room. Joe has spent more than 20 years as a business-minded people and culture leader, including a decade in a Fortune 100 company. He holds an MBA in organizational behavior and HR from Brigham Young University. He's coached and trained thousands of leaders in the US, Europe, South America, and Asia, and has lived all over the world. Joe eventually left the corporate world to become the kind of leadership guide he once wished he had as a CEO. He is now the co-founder and managing partner of Global Leader Group, where he helps organizations find and build great leaders through executive search, leadership consulting, and coaching. Joe, welcome to the podcast. Hey, Joe. Thank you so much for being willing to come on the podcast.
Hey, so excited to be here. This has been something I've been excited for a while, so I appreciate making time for me today.
Awesome. And I'm very excited to hear your principles and hear all of your leadership advice for anyone listening, especially the rising generation, which I hope to inspire, especially me being in that generation, to become better leaders. And to jump in, the first question always, as I want to focus on real stories from real leaders, who is one of the greatest leaders you've had in your life? And what were some of the leadership attributes they possessed that made their leadership stand out to you?
And there's so many, so if it's okay, I'll give you a few different ones, but I promise they'll be engaging enough stories that it'll still make sense. But yeah,
Please do.
it's been said the most important work that I will ever do is within the walls of my own home. And I've been fortunate and very grateful that my wife is actually one of the best leaders I've ever known. And so if you think about it, I'm out working most of the day, and so she's the one that's actually home with the kids, and so her example is bigger than anything. So I'll share just a few of the stories about her. For example, I remember just the other day, I was pulling down the street and I saw two vans that had just barely collided. It was at the point where the airbags were deployed. There was stuff all over the road. And then all of a sudden I realized, oh my gosh, that's my van. And I look
Okay.
in there and the airbag was deployed and my wife was still in the driver's seat. The first responders were in there trying to get her out. I had my other kids that were in the car, and my young 9-year-old daughter runs up to me, gives me a big hug, and is just tears streaming down. Now, luckily, they're okay now, but it was what happened later that day that made me realize as leaders, we don't usually get to choose exactly when we're going to have those moments that can
Mm,
change and inspire our life. But it happened with my daughter later that day. So my wife is still recovering. She's still a little bit injured. And my daughter comes up to her and she's just so distraught. And she said, Mom, why did God do this? Why was this car accident part of his plan? Now, think about it in that moment, you as a leader. One, if my wife wasn't present, she was on her phone or doing something else, she would have missed this opportunity to be
mm,
able to have an incredible interaction with my daughter. But my wife, being brilliant, she took a moment and she stopped. And then she said something to the effect of, Well, McKinley, we send you off to school, right? My daughter's like, Well, yeah, you send me to school. And she goes, But what if somebody's really mean to you at school? What if there's a big bully and they're mean to you? Do you sit to yourself and say, Why did mom send me to school to be a part of this bully? My dad was like, No, well, no, of course I wouldn't do that. My mom said, or my wife said, Okay, why? And she said, Well, you can't control what other people do.
mm.
It's that bully that had their own actions, their own agency to do what they wanted to do. And my wife said, Yeah, but notice this way. You were actually born by me, and I kept you in my home for a long time. But then there came a time where I knew that in order for you to become who you can become, there's certain lessons that I can't teach you at home. And so
Right.
I was willing for you to go to school and go out of the home so that you can learn these different lessons. And I knew that there would be times when you would fall and scrape your knee, or that there would be a bully. But I also knew there was times that you were going to learn stuff that you couldn't learn here, and you're going to meet people that you wouldn't meet here. And all of a sudden you saw kind of the light bulb go off in my daughter, and she's like, Oh, I get it. So maybe it wasn't God who planned it, but it's part of his plan to be able to comfort us when bad things do happen. Now, that's just a simple little example of a story. But if I think of the best leaders out there, they are one present for when opportunities arise, when somebody's wanting some advice or counsel. And then luckily, my wife was there to be able to put together a quick story analogy that taught her a principle where we could try to teach her all day long, but until something happens to where she's really hungry to learn, that's when now she's ready to be able to hit. So I actually don't believe everything happens for a reason. I don't believe it does, but I do believe that whatever happens, he can make the most out of it.
Mm. That's amazing. That's this principle of presence, being there when, because like you said, a leader has no idea when there's going to be an opportunity to inspire somebody or really be there for somebody. And you're the second person who shared that principle of presence as a leader. Other people I've had, military leaders, business leaders, they've said, they shared stories of being in the military where generals were flying all through the country in Afghanistan and Iraq, being present with their soldiers. And this story, even with your wife and your daughter, without being there and being present with them, that opportunity was lost. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, my pleasure. And Jackson, if you're okay, can I share a few more stories about my wife, and then we'll share some other leaders
Yes,
too?
please do. Please do.
Another one that made me think about this is a lot of times as leaders, it's not what we say, but it's who we are that they learn the most from. So I'm going to use my wife as another example of my daughter. But this is one where I'll be honest, I am terrible at making dinner. My wife and I, it's like our least favorite thing to do. It's crazy that every single day my kids feel like they should be eating 3 times a day. Uh, and we're terrible at it. So it finally gets to the point where we'll do like a paper, rock, scissors to decide, okay, who has to make dinner tonight? So
Right.
usually it ends with us being like, okay, we're gonna do mac and cheese, or we're gonna do PB&J, or we're gonna do whatever it is and say, okay, you can either eat that or go to bed hungry. And it usually involves tears and probably one or two Bluey episodes to where we're trying to get the courage to be more like Bandit and Chili. But there was one night where my wife got the lower straw, so she had to make dinner, and she was just exhausted, didn't want to do it. And somewhat jokingly, she hid behind the table, underneath the table, and was like, "Hey, I'm not going to make dinner. I'm not going to do any of it." And somewhat jokingly, but also a little bit probably exhausted for the day. And that same daughter, the 9-year-old, she got down on her knees to be able to be eye level with my wife. And she did something that I thought was so awesome. She said, Mom, I can see you're really struggling. Do you want to talk about it? Thought, what a brilliant, she had seen my wife do that to her. Now when she's needing something, she can do it. And then my wife was like, yeah, I don't want to make dinner. I'm just really struggling. And then my daughter said, "Oh, I get it, Mom. That could be really tricky." And then finally my daughter said, well, Mom, what if I helped? What if we could do something to make it super fun? What if we created like a dance and we did a recipe we've never made and we just figure out how to have fun with it? Now, notice what she did. Super simple, but one, she got down to the level of my wife. Two, instead of being like, oh, don't feel that way. You're a mom. You shouldn't feel that way. She met my wife where her feelings were and said, hey, I get it. Do you want to talk about it? I can see you're struggling. And then three, she knew my wife's love language, which is how to make something more fun. They ended up
Mm.
making dinner, having a dance, a bunch of different things. And it was another example to me of my daughter doesn't just naturally create these type of things. She had seen that example through my wife so many times that it now became ingrained, and that's how she lives. That's who she is. So that's another example of the type of leader that I want to be, from the boardroom to the family room.
Mm. I like that. I've seen you, talk about that online, from the boardroom to the family room, and how that example is it's crazy. I mean, your 9-year-old daughter sounds much more mature than me to be able to get on your
She
knees,
is
get to the
more than all of
level,
us.
and be able to care for her mom like that. That's an amazing story.
Yeah. Your question was so good. Are you okay if I just do two more quick leadership examples, leader
Yes,
examples?
please, as much as you can. This is what I call golden nuggets that we're getting
Yeah,
out of.
it's all about the story. So
Yeah,
I had another time where when I was newly married, so I'm pretty young at this time, I'm in my early mid 20s, and it's usually somebody gets braces on when they're younger in life. For
right.
me, I didn't. I got them actually as an adult. So I was super cool and had braces for my wedding pictures, which is awesome. But I was going through a time where I was in a leadership position and they asked me, hey, Joe, can you please just do a quick kind of public announcement for our team? We're talking like 20 people.
Mm.
Now, this is at a time when I was pretty insecure and I had a little bit of a stutter. And I remember turning them and I was terrified. It's super small room, but I actually turned it down. I said, no, I can't. I'm too nervous. Now, later that year, I went to a conference and it was just thousands of people. And there was a speaker up on stage named Ed Milet. And Ed
Yep.
Milet, in fact, Ed, I was watching YouTube. He's actually huge now. This was back before
Yeah, he's
everyone
huge.
knew who Ed Milet was. But he was speaking for this small little group. And I remember looking at him on stage and being like, oh my gosh, that's the type of person I want to be. Imagine if I could do that. Now, Ed doesn't know who I am, but it was something that he was sharing a lesson and he talked about the identity thermostat. So the concept was all of us, we have, it's like a thermostat of our identity. And let's say we set the thermostat to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And just for the sake of this analogy, let's say that if it gets warmer, it means things are going good. So if my thermostat's set at 70 degrees and all of a sudden maybe I get a promotion, I start making more money and it gets to 80, 90 degrees. Maybe my relationships are going even better. I'm showing up the way I want to at 100 degrees, 120 degrees. What he said is, think about how a thermostat works. If the heat is all the way up there, what will the thermostat do? It will
Great.
turn on the air conditioning to bring it back down to 70 degrees. The
Mm.
reverse is also true. If let's say I leave the door open in the wintertime and it's cold and now it gets to 40 degrees, 30 degrees, the thermostat will then turn on the heat to get it back to 70 degrees. But it'll get to 70 degrees and stop. And when Ed was sharing this, it was like he was speaking directly to my soul because he then says, okay, who gets to set your thermostat? And I realized, oh my gosh, I'm setting a thermostat of what I'm capable of, who I become, so much lower than what's possible. And it's up to me to set it to 80 degrees, 90 degrees, 120 degrees, because I don't want to be the one that's self-sabotaging myself to get back down to 70 degrees.
Mm.
And I remember looking at Ed and thinking, someday I'm going to be up on a stage like that. Now, at the time, it gave me butterflies just thinking about it. I was about to vomit just thinking because I was so scared. But with that concept of if it's out there, it's possible, and why not me? I started working at it. I started doing small little speaking engagements. I started being open to failing and learning and okay, what worked, what didn't work, how can I do it better? To the point where now I was just barely giving a keynote. I've given keynotes now to thousands of different people in different settings, and I love it. And I
Mm.
remember one of the ladies came up to me just last week. I was doing it for, it was a small little group of 40 in HR leadership team. And she said, how do I learn to be able to facilitate and speak like you just did? And it was a moment to be like, well, hey, this wasn't where you end up. It took me iteration after iteration of being able to do that. But when I think of leadership, a lot of times we think it has to be my manager or my boss. No, it was simply Ed was showing me that there's potential in me and letting me rise to something that's bigger than what I was currently at. That's another thing to think about with leadership is the impact that a leader has, the ripple effect of what they can do is a sacred responsibility, and I don't take it lightly.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I have a kind of a follow-up question
Please.
based on what you're saying, because Ed now is huge and a
Yeah.
very
This is
big
before he
influence.
was known by anyone,
Yeah.
really.
And you learn from him to set your own thermostat. And so for someone like me, that's inspiring to me. Okay, I'm setting the threshold, the minimum threshold of, essentially my success. Where do I want to raise to and continue to improve? But what you're saying is one way to do that is you have to go through iteration after iteration, which might mean failure after failure. And so if you have maybe some insight to us, how does someone get over that hump of being willing to fail and maybe fail fast and fail continuously before they get to where they want to go?
Oh, such a good question. Um, you're kind of knowing my style. I'm going to share another story to answer that question.
Okay.
But when I was in college, I was taking a class, and my professor got up and he was talking about his son and said, oh, my son, he's in a band and they're living at my house. I hope someday they make it so that they'll live and leave my house because it's a little bit hard. Well, it turns out that band was Maroon 5.
Oh,
So
wow.
they ended up making it. So I was super curious over the years to learn more about his name is James Valentine. He's the lead guitarist.
Hmm.
And so one thing about James that's so interesting is I was listening to him talk about how creativity happens. And he was saying, look, some people see our music and they think we just created this amazing song all of a sudden. He said, no, you don't realize the reason we're able to do that is because I'm willing to create really cringy songs so many times until it gets better and better and better until finally we get something that we feel like the world will like. So his whole way of saying being creative, you have to create to be creative and being willing to be able to do that. And he used the analogy of saying, think about like an old house. You turn on the faucet after it's not been on for a long time. Initially, it's brown water that runs out. That's
Right.
the cringy music that he said he initially has to be willing to let go out. But eventually, the clear starts flowing. So here you have James Valentine, who I think is one of the most brilliant guitarists to one of the most brilliant bands of our generation. And he still has an online guitar tutor that helps
Mm.
him be able to do it. And he's willing to put together that cringy music so many times because he doesn't look at it as failure. He looks at it, this is simply the part of the process. And it's that same part of the process that later, he said one of the best moments of his life is he's sitting in Queens, or the artist formerly known as Prince, I should say. He's
Right.
sitting with Prince in Prince's house, jamming out on the guitar. No video because they're not creating it for social media. They were creating it for themselves. And he said, I was sitting in that moment, I thought, I was so willing to put together cringy music and see it as the process. And now here I am with the artist formerly known as Prince. So my
Right.
advice to you and to me would be don't look at it as failure. Look at it as that's simply part of the process. And I'm willing to go through the discomfort of not having it be right at the very beginning because I know everything I really want is on the other side of feeling uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's amazing. And thank you for sharing that. It reminds me, I have a friend who's one of his mentors that he looks up to, and someone I respect is Justin Sua. He's a performance
Yeah.
coach and leadership, has many great leadership principles. And he was talking to my friend who has met with him in mentorship capacity. And Justin says, you have to be willing to climb Cringe Mountain for a while.
Oh, I
And
love it.
and being willing to put yourself out there. And so I kind of, that just reminded me what you're saying and not seeing it as failure, but just seeing it as steps along the path to your success. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'll give one
Yeah.
more story and then we can go to your second question.
Okay.
It's such a good question because you think about it and you're like, okay, what is it about different leaders? I'm reminded of Jane McNair. Jane was my first manager. I had just barely gotten out of business school. I was still earlier in my career. And Jane was phenomenal at showing me how to do it well. And then almost every single interaction after, she said, okay, what can we do better? What's an EBI, an even better if? And we
Mm.
would dissect, okay, I could do this, I could do that. Or I remember one day we were in a pretty big meeting and it was going to be a bunch of presidents and vice presidents. This is for a Fortune 100 company. So as somebody newer in their career, I was a little bit intimidated. So I
Right.
walk into the room and there's four chairs around a table, but I knew that there was about eight of us that were supposed to be in that meeting. So I look at the chairs around the table and I think, I'm just going to go sit on the side. So I don't sit at the table. I go sit at one of the side chairs. Jane walks in, she sees me there, and you could just see it was like, okay, a conversation's going to happen after this. We
Right.
go back to her office and she goes, hey, Joe, I noticed that when you went into that room, you sat on the side. Tell me a little bit more about why that was. Now, notice she didn't come in with guns blazing saying, how dare you do this? It was, I noticed. And then she gave me an opportunity to think about it. And I said, I think it was more of I was just being considerate of them because I knew there was only four spots. And, and she goes, Joe, tell me really, why didn't you take one of those four chairs? And when I was being really honest with myself, it was like, well, look, I didn't feel like I deserved it.
Mm.
And she said something that I will never forget. She said, Joe, don't ever give up an opportunity to have a seat at the table. That simple little comment of one, her being able to notice, and then two, give me feedback and then help me think about it. From that time forward, I kind of assumed I had a seat at the table, physically and metaphorically. I just assumed that I was part of it. And that whole imposter syndrome and all the other different stuff, similar to Ed Milet's of raising your temperature of what you're
Mhm.
able to do, game changer for me after that.
Yeah, I love that. Always understanding that, essentially you're speaking of your worth. You walk into a room, you're worthy to be there. You have a seat at the
Yeah.
table and not taking that, not self-selecting out. My wife is in her first year of law school, and so we went through the whole LSAT test prep,
Yeah.
applying for all these law schools, and you get your LSAT score back, you got your GPA, your grades, and it's like, well, I shouldn't apply to, in this Ivy League or whatever it
Yeah.
is. And we had these many conversations of don't self-select out. You deserve a seat at the
So good.
table. and you're worthy. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you for all the stories. I really appreciate the stories. That's my biggest focus on the podcast. That's why it has the name Front Lines of Leadership, true, real stories from people's lives. So thank you for sharing those.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, and let's move to the next question.
Okay.
Something that how this came about, speaking to the rising generation, stories and principles to teach and inspire the rising generation of leaders. And a lot of times, someone graduates college or they're in their first early job in their career. You're not necessarily going to have a leadership position or a leadership role. And so for someone who doesn't necessarily have a former leadership role yet, how can they start being a leader now, before they get that role?
Yeah. I think it starts with how you even define leadership. If you want to think about leadership in a simple, it's how do I see the potential in either people, process, or a product, and then inspire and equipped to continually progress. So if you think of that definition, a leader doesn't even mean you have a leadership title or manager title. Are you someone that you take it upon yourself? You're accountable to yourself to say, I'm going to see the potential in either a person, and that could be yourself, it could be somebody else, or a process. So you see something's not working and you're not just going to wait and be like, oh yeah, somebody should fix that. No, you see a problem. Why don't you become the person that says, hey, let me dissect and see what's going on and see if we can find a way to be able to do this better, faster, you name it, or a product even. So I like the concept of thinking like it's your company because it is. Whether you're
Mm.
an employee or you don't have to be an entrepreneur and own the company to say it's your company. So just seeing that potential in something and working towards making it better, that alone is how you start. And over time, it's going to be seen, but you're not doing it to be seen. You're doing it because you find fulfillment in being able to see the potential in something.
Yeah. Just in a recent podcast, I was learning from a leader and you mentioned people and processes in your answer now. And he talked about this research that had been done at Ohio State, and they took 1,800 leadership behaviors, and then they did a bunch of research and narrowed all 1,800 of those down to two things, and that was people and processes. Ultimately,
Ooh,
leadership came down to how do you interact and encourage people, and then how do you streamline the processes and improve processes. So I think that kind of goes along with what you're saying, to inspire those and equip those with like progression over time rather than focusing, this is my role now. I don't have to be tied to my position or my role, but rather the people that I'm impacting and the processes that I'm trying to improve.
yeah, I love it. And I just kind of always assumed I had ownership to be able to do it.
Hmm.
And realistically, I maybe got slapped on the wrist a few times, but the majority of times they were like, that was awesome. Thanks for doing it. Instead of being like, is it okay if I do this? Do I have permission to be able to solve this better? Or no, you just kind of assume you have the authority, and then a lot of times they give it to you over time.
Yeah, and I think that can be hard, like especially I've had it in my own experience in my work now for the software company that I work for. It can be hard to be willing to make mistakes because one, your reputation's on the line. If you do something that maybe was on the line of should I have made that decision or not, and it doesn't work out, obviously that's your reputation on the line. But being again, it goes back to what we talked about, being willing to make those mistakes so that you improve later on. I really enjoy that
Yeah.
principle.
But part of it's also communication. So, for example, when I would have interns, a lot of times the interns would come in and think, oh, I'm going to show that I'm so good by hearing at first what you want, what your expectation is for my project or internship or whatever it is, but I'm not going to bother you. And I'm going to wait until the end of the internship. And now I'm going to come to you at the very end with this amazing end product. And I said,
Yes.
that is your easiest way to fail. That's not success. The best interns would have iterations of communication. So, yes, they would take what is my project, what it is, but then they wouldn't wait to be told what to do. They would start making action steps. Okay, here's what I think. Here's the questions I should ask. Here's who I should talk to. Here's my hypothesis. Okay, here's what I think next. And then they would meet with those stakeholders to say, okay, here's where I'm at. Here's what I'm thinking. What are your thoughts? And get kind of that buy in throughout. And then what's going to happen? It's kind of like a heat seeking missile. It's never 100% straight on target. It's constantly making small little course adjustments. And so that's the other concept too, is when I say take ownership, it wasn't I was going to go and wait to the very end of doing something big and all of a sudden they're like, hey, I never sponsored that. What do you do? No, I would proactively find little things but I was great at that stakeholder management to communicate.
Mhm.
And then if they said, you know what, actually, that's not a priority, peace, no problem. I'll go to something else that is. I'll find another problem, or I'll say to my manager or my leader, what problems do you see? And I'll go figure out solutions to those. But that's the other key piece is I'm not saying doing it in a vacuum. I'm saying iterate together with them because people support what they co-create.
Yeah, I was that intern. I learned that lesson the hard way. I remember my internships. You want to get this project, you want to kind of come in and
Yeah.
impress your manager, like I'm gonna get the rule, I'm gonna get the instructions, I'm gonna get it done. Kind of like just be smooth with it and turn it in. It's gonna be this great thing. And I learned that lesson very early that to meet in and tap in with those stakeholders to get the right results.
Yeah,
But thanks for
exactly.
sharing
In fact,
that.
no,
Yeah,
my
go ahead.
pleasure. The other thing too is think about when I first started my main job after the graduate school, my manager was absent for like the first 8 months. And so I didn't have anyone telling me what to do, what's good, what's bad. And so I could have just floundered and tried to do it. But what I did was every single day, I pretty much picked up the phone and found one or two people that knew better than I did on
Mm,
whatever that issue was and be like, hey, do you have just a quick 5 minutes? I'm going through this situation. Here's what I think, but can you tell me what are your thoughts? What am I missing? And then the next day, because I didn't want to bother the same person, I did the same thing to two other different people.
right.
It actually was the best thing that could have ever happened to me because after 6 months, I had the best of the best of 60 different people and all of their insights. And so that's the other key thing too. Don't wait for just your manager. Go start reaching out, learning from others. But it wasn't a, hey, here's the problem. Tell me what to do. It was, here's the problem. Here's how I'm thinking about it. What do you think about? What am I missing? And I built relationships along that process too.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think it's important to understand you're not the smartest person in the room. And when you have that kind of mindset, I'm not the smartest person in the room, then you start talking to other people, you start getting the right minds on it, and then that's how you complete the project the most efficiently and the best outcome usually.
Yeah. My current CEO, Jonathan, what I love about him is when we go into a meeting, he'll purposefully be curious. Think about it. Anytime you go into a conversation, you've got two doors you can go into. Door number one is I'm right, you're wrong. Door number two is curiosity.
Hmm.
A lot of times leaders come into the I'm already right door, which makes them cut off to hear different opinions or views or dissent. Versus if you're in that curiosity door, you're thinking, oh, I wonder why they said that. I wonder what they're thinking. I wonder what data they have to support that. So, what Jonathan does is he says when he goes into a meeting, he doesn't even care what the best solution is. He wants to make sure that he has the right questions so that he can tease out amongst the team the right dialogue.
Hmm.
That to me was one of the biggest aha moments to realize, oh, as a leader, I don't have to have all the solutions. In fact, it's almost better if I don't,
Right.
because I'm going to truly be curious to learn from others. And if I can be learning from others, if I leave the room with the best solution, that's way better than entering in with it. So that mentality switch was also something that I think was super helpful for me to hear.
Yeah, this is all great insight. I think you have so many great stories that I'm even just sitting here, asking them, and I just want to continue to hear more and more. That's
Hey, you're
amazing.
kind.
Well, we'll move on to the next question if that's okay.
Okay,
This question
please.
is kind of obviously you have great experience and a plethora of stories about leadership principles for your own life and also for others, kind of being in that realm in the industry that you work in. And so this question, I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. What principle or habits has most contributed to your growth as a leader over time?
Ooh, most contributed to growth as a leader over time. I can think of a few. Let me think of the first one. I would say the greatest predictor of future successful job performance is EQ, emotional intelligence. I don't think there's anything that has been more impactful to my success or the success of leaders that I coach than EQ. Real quick, what is EQ? A lot of times we hear of IQ,
Right.
intellectual quotient. That's more of my ability to understand different pieces of information and put together decision making and thinking processes to be able to make good sound decisions. EQ is the other type of smart. EQ is, and we'll say EQ, even though it's emotional intelligence, it should be EI. We say emotional quotient or EQ. So if I say EQ or emotional intelligence, same thing. But think
Right.
of EQ as my ability to recognize and manage my own emotions and behaviors, and to be able to recognize and better respond to the emotions of others so that I can connect. So if you think about that, if you can improve that, and here's the best part about EQ, it's not a I was born with a genetic lottery or I wasn't. You can develop it just like a muscle. And so I think that's been the biggest thing, especially because earlier in my career, I didn't have high EQ. I was so focused on results and the outcomes that I wasn't taking the time to really understand even my own emotions and being aware of that. So let me give you a quick example. You're going to notice a lot of my examples are at home. And the reason why is I believe great leadership is from the boardroom to the family room. And
Right.
as great it is to help a leader improve their business and grow revenue, which is awesome. And I love it. My biggest fulfillment is when they say, I showed up as a better person in my personal life.
Mm.
That to me is fulfillment. So here's a quick example. My daughter, she had just barely had a really rough day. She's a teenager, and a bunch of the girls were saying really harsh rumors that weren't true. So she came home just in tears. Now think of EQ. EQ is first understanding my own emotions so that I can control it before I show up. The old me would have been like, hey, that's not even true. Don't worry about it. Don't pay attention to it. Or I'd be like, hey, it's not, suck it up. Don't be scared. Like, you do you notice how I wasn't even aware of or showing her empathy of what was happening with herself? And the reason why is because I also wasn't self-aware enough for myself. It was almost like I felt that I needed her to feel better in order for me to feel better.
Mm.
And instead, when you realize, look, it's not even about me, process your own baggage and emotions so that you don't show up to that conversation with it. I could fully focus on her. And so the difference there was I could then sit down and be like, hold up, she's feeling something. How do I help her feel that and meet her where she's at? Completely different outcome instead of me trying to just go in and fix it or tell her, hey, you shouldn't be feeling that or feeling that as weakness or bad or wrong. Resisting feelings only intensifies them. So that's just one quick example of being able to recognize what's happening in yourself. But think about it in the work setting. Somebody's struggling. They act out a behavior that they don't normally do. And instead of being like, man, I can't believe you did that, it's, hey, I noticed that that was a little bit different than what you've been doing. Are you okay?
Mm.
That difference is pretty dramatic. And if I think of the principle behind EQ, it's emotions don't happen to you, emotions are created by you.
Mm.
So if you can start realizing I'm not feeling that way because of anything external to me, but instead it's a thought that's going through my brain that then triggers an emotional fuel that feels in my body. Now I take back control versus feeling like I'm out of control. So that whole EQ concept, and we could go so deep into that one, but I would say that's one of the biggest areas. And in conjunction with that is also the power of beliefs because the beliefs drive emotion. So that mindset aspect of starting to become aware of your thoughts and the power those thoughts have, completely game changer.
Wow. I'm like feeling inspired now. And I've been trying to work on this myself in my own home, in my own personal relationships, me and my wife. And
Yeah.
I think it's just what you said, emotions don't happen to you, they're created by you. That's what is true ownership in your on your holding yourself accountable in your own leadership. And so I'm just thinking now, how can I do that? How can I be better and realize the emotions aren't external, they're they're created by me. I have the choice of how to build my emotions and react to any situation. The situation isn't creating that, especially when it's like intense or whether
Yeah.
it's in your home or in the boardroom, like you say, those emotions they can build up when it's tense or when there's an argument or whatever it is. But taking a step back, realizing I'm the one who's creating these emotions. They're not happening to me because of the situation. That's amazing.
Yeah. And Jackson, if you don't mind me asking, what's your spouse's name?
Victoria.
Victoria. This is something that for you and Victoria will be so helpful. So, for example, Victoria says something, words, whatever they are. And this is something when I first got married, I joke with my wife, we've been married 22 years, and I say it was the best 18 years of my life. And the reason why is because our first 3 years were terrible.
Mm,
Like I remember we sat in a room one time when we were like, if this is what marriage is, I don't think I want this.
yeah, right.
And as a young person that dreamed of being married and all that, it was so crushing. But then we started realizing, hold up, we can create whatever type of marriage we want. And a lot of it was, I love her, but I just didn't know some of these different things like EQ or how to show emotion or how I just didn't know it. And so if I can learn that skill, we can have a better relationship. So for example, If your wife says something, a lot of times we think, I'm mad because she said XYZ. No, she said words. That's a neutral circumstance.
Mm,
Whatever interpretation you have of those words, the story you tell yourself, that is actually what you do control. So that simple concept is starting to realize that I'm going to control the controllable. I can't control what they say or what they do, but I can control how I react and how I show up. If only one of you is playing that game of high EQ, the relationship improves. And then over time, a lot of times, both of them start playing that game. That's when
mm.
relationship gets really fun.
Yeah, I think it can be hard, like you're saying, okay, if you have a relationship or a team and only one person is being willing to make those changes, like that can be difficult. But you're saying essentially, even if one person raises the standard of EQ, then usually typically the rest get on board.
Yeah, and here's the difference though. The reason why is because it doesn't even matter if they change. I can have an entirely
Um,
different experience and nothing changes by what they said or what they did. And the reason why is because what they say or what they do is a neutral fact. It's a circumstance. It's outside of their control. What I can control is my story that I make of whatever they said. So now, once again, take back ownership. If I change the story, I then can change my emotion of how I feel, which then changes my action, which changes my results without changing any of the circumstance.
yeah,
So,
that's amazing.
can I give you an example? Because it's
Yeah.
probably hard without an example.
No,
Um,
no, yeah, please.
So, and I'm going to come back to kids because just that you want to improve your EQ, go have children. It's one of I was such a great parent. I knew how to be an amazing parent until I became a parent. And I was like, I know nothing.
Right, right.
Uh, but here's a quick example. I came home from work one day and we have a theater room and we have a rule that if you use the theater room, you clean it up. Pretty simple rule. Well, I
Mm,
walked into the theater room and there was trash everywhere, spilled pop, all this different stuff. And we had a rule that my daughter knows not to do that. And initially I came home and I was pretty frustrated. And I was like, we had this rule. You don't respect me. You don't respect my rules. And I normally am a pretty patient guy. It's like you only have a certain amount of patience juice throughout the day. And
right.
once you use up all that patience juice, the smallest little thing will set you off.
Mhm.
Now, I was sitting in bed that night and I remember thinking, man, I don't like how I showed up tonight. That's not the type of dad I want to be. I don't want to be the type of dad that rules by authority because I'm your dad. I want to be the type of dad that they want to follow, right? And I'm not saying I don't want to hold her accountable, but I just flying off the handle and yelling and all that's not how I want to be. Now, if you were to ask me, why was I upset? I would have told you it's because she left all the trash in the theater room. But notice, that's a neutral circumstance.
Mm,
Cans left in the theater room. That's neutral. I chose, and I didn't realize in the moment that I chose it, right? But I chose to have it mean something like, she doesn't respect me, she doesn't respect my rules. That thought, that belief triggered emotion of frustration, anger. Feeling that frustration, anger because I wasn't self aware and control it, I then acted out in frustration. The result is I showed up as somebody that wasn't respecting her. We
mhm.
call it the bear model. And that's because notice what I just went through. My
Right.
belief of she doesn't respect me or my rules drove my emotion of feeling frustration, anger, which then drove my action of yelling and losing my temper, which then drove the result of I actually don't respect her and show up as a not deliberate father. We call it the bear model because it's causality. So
Mm,
going back to EQ, simply realizing, look, it wasn't what my daughter did or said, it was my response. Now I can create a new story. We talk about neuroscience, retraining your brain, reprogramming your brain, rewiring your brain. I then took back control of saying, okay, next time that happens, so she doesn't have to change. How do I want to show up? And I still want to hold her accountable. But notice the next time it happened, I was able to do it from a place where that night I went to bed and I'm like, that's the type of dad she deserves and
yeah,
that I want to be. And I still had the conversation, but I did it in a way that actually created her wanting to change more.
right. Well, Joe, you shared several things that I hope we can come back to, especially the bear model. I want to come back to that if we can later on, but kind
Sure.
of with what we're talking about now, you shared the example of family, but I think one thing that I'm interested and curious about, you're saying in high pressure situations, You can react a certain way. You don't want to react that way. You're reflecting on it. And then in the future, you react differently. I kind of want to touch on this high pressure
Yeah.
leadership, what it looks like in high pressure or uncertain environments. And then if we can, I would really love to go to the bear model and maybe touch on that a little bit more after. But the question I have for you is, how can someone be a better leader and what does leadership look like in these high pressure or uncertain environments?
Yeah, my first thing is going to be going back to the bear model of first bear up. I call it bear up, meaning you become self-aware of whatever your current belief, emotion, action, or result is. And
Mm,
over time, you get better of usually it happens after the fact. You show up the way you don't want to, and then you're like, okay, what was my belief? Okay, what was my emotion? But over time, you get better and better to where now you can actually do it before you show up the way that you don't want to. So my first advice to anyone is you're in a high pressure situation. There's a lot of change or other different stuff. If you can become aware of your belief in that moment, you now can then control it. Most of us are not aware of our beliefs. We have
mm,
tens of thousands of thoughts every single day, and we're not aware of most of them. So that's my first advice is use the self-awareness to become aware because if you find yourself in that moment, you start getting angry, upset, you're like, okay, hold up, self-awareness. Why am I angry, upset? It's not because of what they said. It's because of my belief or my thought of whatever I'm giving the story about what they said. And now I take back control to how I want to show up. And I can do it in a way that's more productive. Now, I'll give you an example. So the bear model is one thing, but also I'll show how this played out. I was in a really heated conversation. This was back, you got to remember, before we know everything about COVID, this is right when COVID was first discovered. I was
okay.
working for a large company, and one of our factories was in China, right where COVID was discovered.
Dang.
So remember, you got to forget that you know what you know now. We didn't
Yep.
know it was so contagious. We didn't know all the different stuff, but we were in a leadership meeting, and we had some of our employees say, I'm worried about going into the work because of getting COVID. What do I do? Super high pressure. We have our different presidents, other things. And I'm sitting in this meeting, and one of our big leaders said, you know what? They have to be in the office. They absolutely have to be in the office. And I remember thinking, I get it. And normally, especially if it's like a plant role, yes, you have to be on the shop floor in order to do it. But we're talking about finance or HR or other people
Mm,
where technically they could do their job outside of the office. And I said, well, what
right.
about this? If somebody has a child that is more susceptible to getting COVID, and they say, I'm worried to go into the office because I might be exposed, which means I might bring it home and endanger that child. Are you telling me we're still going to force them to go into the office? And he turned to me and he said, yes.
Wow.
Now, I remember in the moment, once again, we have to forget what we know about now. This was at the very beginning of
Yeah,
it
yeah,
was
yeah.
just coming out. We didn't hear about quarantine, like all of that's new, right? That happened after this. But in the moment, I initially was like crazy angry because I was like, how dare you? We say we care about people, but when something comes up that's butting against my value of caring about people and their health and their safety, and we're saying when they really don't have to be there, that they must be, and there's not a good reason why you're giving me of why, I initially got very angry and I realized, hold up, remember self-awareness.
Mhm.
What's going on and what was happening in my own is he was doing something that was a violation of my values, and I was immediately reacting to it. And I had to take a step back and say, okay, how do I have dialogue? Now, I can passionately disagree, but you'll notice if you do it from a state of, once again, I'm right, you're wrong versus curiosity, you're usually not going to win the argument and it's going to be a bad relationship. So in
Right.
the moment, I had to see my bear, become a little bit more relaxed, and then I started asking more and more questions. And I asked things like, hold up, I started realizing he actually doesn't have any children. And no offense, because there's great people that have all different types of demographics and lifestyles, but he didn't have any children. And then my head of legal also didn't have any children. So for them, it was pretty easy to say, yeah, it doesn't matter because they didn't know what it's like to have a child that you're going to get sick because you did. So I was able to ask questions and get them to see maybe a different perspective of someone that does have children to be able to have more dialogue.
Mhm.
Now, do you see the difference there of if I would have just been like, how dare you, you're wrong? we wouldn't have had the dialogue that was needed to be able to flush out the different things. Now, long story short, I even with all of that sharing and all the different stuff, they still decided to have that same policy. And I said, look, I'm going to tell you, I will predict a week or two from now, you will have a revolt from all these different people because I'm violently opposed to it because that's not the values that we're creating. And then if
Right.
they don't, give it a few months and they're going to actually leave the second they can because they're going to realize this is not the place that values them.
Right.
Now, once again, hindsight is a lot easier to be able to see. Well, a week after that decision, they realized, uh-oh, that was the wrong decision. They came back and backtracked, but we had already lost a lot of the goodwill. In fact, myself included, of realizing this is probably not a long-term place for me because it
Mhm.
doesn't align to my values. That was a long
Yeah.
answer, but it's kind of a mixture of your question.
No, thank you for sharing that. That definitely answers it and kind of gives insight more into how you reacted. And I kind of want to touch on that. Eventually you said, a week later they realized that probably wasn't the right decision. Unfortunately, I'd lost some of the goodwill of the team, but if if you wouldn't have responded and gone through the dialogue and, tried to cater that relationship a little bit more and get what needed to be talked about out, pride creeps in and they could have, pushed that off for months, weeks, or months even more. But I imagine because you were willing to take a step back, see your bear, they were now, a week later being willing, humble enough to say, okay, that was the wrong decision and move forward from there rather than through pride and, anger for you and your opinion being
Yeah.
strong handed on that.
And this is where sometimes I'm wrong. Like that, in that view, I actually felt that I was fully justified, but they also felt they were fully justified. So I still wasn't going in and saying my solution is the only right way. I still was curious to say, okay, help me understand why you're saying that.
Mm.
Help me understand this. And that's when it was revealed to me a little bit more of why they were feeling the way that they were feeling. But if I wasn't able to go through that myself, I would probably have showed up in a way that I look back and I'm like, "Ah, I don't like how I showed up. Versus I felt great about how I showed up. I didn't like the outcome, but I was like, hey, I did what I could do. And sometimes as a leader, here's the hardest part of that whole situation. When you're in a room and you're going through dialogue and the decision's not what you think is right, as a leader, you still have to get in the boat and row after a decision's made. It was the hardest thing for me to go back
Yeah.
to my client groups and say, here's what we're doing and why. That's hard. And because I didn't fully believe it myself, and that's as a leader, that's going to be one of your hardest things of if it goes up against your values, that's when I think it's a little bit different to where it's like, look, that's not something I want to be a part of. And I decided that was not going to be an organization I stayed at. And many people left and said that was the reason why, because they
Mhm.
realized that. However, that's not always the case. If it's not misaligned with your values, as a leader, you still have to get in the boat and row, even if it's not your decision. And that's just something that you're going to have to learn to do too as you get into bigger positions.
Right. Well, Joe, I've really loved all of the stories you've told so far, and I've really learned even just in this face-to-face with you, I'm learning live from you and all these things. And if you
Great.
don't mind, I do have just a couple more questions before we
Please,
wrap
let's
up.
keep going.
Sweet. Well, as you know, and as I've mentioned multiple times today, this podcast, I hope, is to inspire the rising generation of leaders. And I started this kind of as an internal, looking internally, how can I be a better leader? And I want to learn from people like you. And so I want to interview you. And even if no one listens to my podcast again, I'm learning, even if not another
I'm
soul
learning too.
here.
So you got two at least two people that are willing participants learning together.
Good, thank you. And so this question kind of stems from that, is I'm interested to know from your experience whether that's working with young professionals or visualizing your own kids or maybe young adults in your community or even at companies that younger employees that you've worked with at companies. What do you see that young leaders do well in our day and maybe some things where we might tend to struggle and we could improve?
Yeah, I love that. My oldest is actually 20 years old.
Okay.
He's over in Paris right now. So I have first line experience too of that along with the people that I work with. I think one of the greatest advantages is also one of the greatest disadvantages to your generation. And that is the focus on mental health and that health matters. I think of the positive side, I absolutely love it because what we're doing is we're saying EQ. That's really what we're talking about. We're now becoming aware that we have emotions and then
Mhm.
how do I better manage it and to realize that our health is more important than outcome and results and other things like that. And you've got to take care of that. I love that aspect. But then there's the other side of it too, where I feel like sometimes it's actually standing in the way of what they really want and need to do to get the outcomes they want. For example, our brain doesn't understand the difference between physical pain and emotional discomfort.
Mm.
So if I put my hand on fire, my brain says, "Ooh, that hurts. Don't put your hand on fire." That's physical pain. But if I'm going through something that's challenging and I feel the emotional discomfort, my brain also tells me it's the same thing. "Ooh, that's bad. Don't go there." The problem I see with some of the new generation is if they feel that discomfort or it's not something that they're fully passionate about, a lot of times they're like, okay, that means I shouldn't be going there. And they don't go through processing those emotions to do the actions because everything they really wanted is on the other side of feeling that discomfort. For example, I know of some people that they were at a job for like 3 months and then it got hard. They had to learn new skills. And they're like, you know what? It just required too much effort. It was super uncomfortable. I had to be on calls and I didn't know what to say. And so I just left. Like, no, like you've got to go through that in order to get what you really want. Or I'd have people say, you know, I just wasn't passionate about that job. And part of me is like, I get it, but if you're working at Arby's and you're 16 years old, sometimes you have to show up when you don't want to show up, even if it's not changing the world, because
Right.
that's simply, you got to go and work. And so I think there's a little bit of this spectrum where health matters is so good, but also don't let it be to the detriment of feeling the discomfort and doing it anyway and going after the hard.
Right. I have a mentor. He's actually my uncle, and many times I've talked to him about, stories of people in my generation who, go to work, they don't like it, they quit or whatever it is. And he kind of has taught me like, look, there is that give and take of you do got to earn your stripes. You do got to go through the hard things.
Yeah.
But also at the same time, I love what you're saying, understanding how both your physical and mental health plays into that. And I've seen that for myself. A lot of times, me and other people, we know the hard thing that we need to do. And usually the thing we want is just on the other side of that. But it's just
Yeah.
committing to being willing to do the hard thing. And usually, like I said, we know what it is.
Yeah.
So I think that's amazing advice that you gave. Thank you.
But look at what you're doing, Jackson. You had a desire. You know what? I want to learn more about leadership. I'm going to go create a podcast. At first, you probably didn't know what equipment do I need? How do I get it posted? Who do I talk to? But notice you didn't let that stop you. You said, yeah, everything's figure outable. I'll figure it out. You
Right.
contacted me on LinkedIn without knowing me. It
Mm.
was brilliant.
Thank
And I was
you.
like, yeah, I would love to help out. I would love to learn and give back. And I'm learning myself. But notice how you, instead of just being like, hey, I'm waiting for things to come to me, you're proactively feeling that discomfort of learning new things and trying it. And because of that, I'm like, you're going to be successful in whatever you try to do because you're willing to do the hard. So,
Thank you.
so
Well, I
kudos to
appreciate
you.
that. Thank you. And I appreciate again you coming on, and I'll be honest. I mean, hasn't been the easiest thing,
Yeah.
being willing to record myself and then when I'm editing, having to listen to my own voice and like
Oh,
that, like that's the
join the
worst thing.
club. I'm like, who is
Yeah.
that guy?
Yeah.
Oh man, we
Yeah.
we get so annoyed with ourselves. But this has been my other thing to realize too. Brooke Castillo says you could be the juiciest peach on the tree, and some people simply don't like peaches.
Mm.
So if you can realize I'm not for everyone, it actually gives me a lot more comfort to realize there's some people listening to this podcast and will be like, "Oh, you know what? That's not for me. I didn't jive with what he was saying or how he said it." No problem. I'm not for
Mhm.
everyone. But if there is one person out there that found value in it, awesome. Those are my people, and I want to surround myself with more of those people.
Right. And that's my goal. Even if it inspires one person, and every time I do this, that person tends to be me. So
Love it.
mission accomplished.
Yeah.
Well, Joe, thank you so much. I have one more question
Sure.
that I'd love to focus on and get your advice, um, and kind of how this has played into your ability to be a leader and
Yeah.
grow as a leader, even now in your life. I'm me personally, I like to say I'm, man of business, a man of education, whatever it is, but I'm also a man of faith and believe in God orchestrating this life. And I'd love to hear from you how your faith has contributed to your ability to be a great leader.
Man, thank you for asking such a thought-provoking question that I appreciate it. We don't talk about this enough. Let's first talk about what do I mean by faith? Because whether you have faith in a higher being or whatever it is, here's how I think of faith. To me, it's not faith in the outcome. It's faith in Jesus Christ or Heavenly Father or whatever your faith is, despite the outcome.
Mm.
Notice the difference. It's faith in trusting what I already know about God to allow me to trust him for all the things I don't yet know why. That's the difference and that's why faith to me has been such a key part of my life of who I am and who I'm going after. Surprisingly, here's some stories that make me think about how faith was. If I think about my career, so when I first started, it was so hard to get into the MBA program at BYU. I always wanted to go to BYU. I bleed blue, but for some reason I was terrible at taking the GMAT. I would
Mm.
take it and bomb, and then I would take it again, and I had one super high score in one area and super low in the other, and then I'd study a little bit more, and then it flipped where I had
Right.
super high.
Yeah.
And I'm like, man, finally, luckily they let me in. So I'm in this amazing program, and these companies are coming, and I narrowed it down to my top three companies. In order, it was Procter and Gamble,
Hmm.
and then it was GE, and then it was Honeywell. Now, when I'm going through that process, the way that Procter and Gamble, it's a great company, great from an HR standpoint. That's what I do. And they have it part of the process where you have to take an assessment, online assessment. And if you don't pass the assessment, you don't get to move forward. So I'm in the computer lab. Now, that's how old I am. We had a computer lab versus laptops and everything. But I'm in the computer lab and I'm taking this assessment. And all of a sudden, I click the button to advance it and it freezes.
Oh
And I'm
no.
freaking out a little bit because it's a time test. And depending on how you answer a question, you either get a harder or an easier question next. And I'm like, I click it again, nothing. I click it like 10 times because I'm like, time is wasting. Then all of a sudden, it advances 10 different questions without me allowing to answer it.
Oh
I'm like, oh,
no.
you got to be kidding me. I get out of the computer lab. I call the recruiter and say, hey, there was an error. Can I please retake the test? Because I know it's not going to give an accurate answer. Because Joe, don't worry about it. We really like you. We're pretty confident it'll still work out. Well, they come to campus and I'm thinking, this is my top company. I'm going to get an offer. I got an offer from almost every other company I tried for, but P&G said, actually, because you didn't pass the test, we can't submit an offer, even though we want you. And I'm like, no, but remember, the test didn't work. He said, I know, but my hands are tied. Now, I could look at this and be like, man, that is terrible. What I've come think about faith. I believe that I make the best decisions I can. I take data, I think about it, I think about pros and cons, and then I take it to someone that knows a whole lot more than me, which is to me is my heavenly Father, God, or superpower, however you want to phrase it to who it is for you. And then he'll either give me a red light, green light, or a yellow light. A
Mm.
red light is a no, don't do it. A green light is yes, do it. Or yellow is a kind of like what you do when you drive a car. If you're going through a yellow light, you slam on the gas to go through it, right?
Yeah.
If you're a yellow light, you just make a decision and then he'll later tell you if it's green or red. But I realized, you know what? Turns out that's a red light. Even though if it were up to me, I would be at P&G. So
Right.
option number two, I'm at GE. GE calls me up for an offer. I'm so excited. This is where I wanted to go. Great HR program. And the recruiter's talking to me on the phone. And he goes, I gotta warn you, we don't negotiate salaries. So whatever I tell you, we don't negotiate it. You either accept or you don't accept. I'm like, okay. Now this is at a time where I had several children. I went back to get my MBA later on in life. I
Right.
had to provide for my family. I took off 2 years to go to school. I had no income, very challenging from that standpoint. So I wish I could say money didn't matter, but I had to pay bills, right, to be able to feed
Right.
my family. So I'm on the phone and he gives me a number and it was like, oh my gosh. It was such a low number that I was like, I don't think I can support my family that way. So my second company, I was like, okay, that's out. The third company, Honeywell, which I loved and I ended up choosing Honeywell, by the way,
Right.
calls me up and gives me an incredible offer. I'm so excited. While I'm on the phone with Honeywell, GE calls me on the other line and leaves a message. Joe, urgent, you got to call me. I'm so sorry I made a mistake. I call back the GE recruiter and he says, I gave you the weekly salary or the monthly salary when it should have been the weekly. So I
Mm.
basically gave you four times less than what it should have been. Please accept my apology. And I said, I just accepted my other offer, so I'm moving forward. Now, you could
Wow.
look at that and say, that was just chance. But the way that I look at it, my faith says, when I make a decision and maybe it's not the best outcome, he's going to intervene and be able to help me do something that's going to be even better. So I made a commitment in my life that if I feel inspired to do something, I will follow it and I will trust him, even when I don't know the outcome yet. So fast forward, I'm now in Switzerland with Honeywell. Loved my time there. We were there for about 5 years. And I loved the company. I loved what I was doing. We were feeling like locals. We put my kids in local schools. They
Mhm.
all spoke French. So I'm thinking I'd retire there. I start getting this feeling of, nope, you need to leave Switzerland and start a company. No, I worked my whole life to finally get kind of the golden handcuffs, if you will.
Right.
Last thing I'm going to do is leave Switzerland and start a company that has no income. No. And I kept putting that on the back burner of no, 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 no. Finally, it got too strong where I said, all right, I will follow it. And within a few weeks, we left Honeywell. We started Global Leader Group about 5.5, 6 years ago. Now, when I came to this back to the States, if I didn't know that that was 100% guided from him, I would constantly look back with regrets. Now, here's some of the stuff that happened. A few months after that, I started having some pain in my stomach, and I hate going to the hospital, and I'm cheap, so I don't want to go there. So
Right.
finally got to the point where I'm like, okay, I should probably go talk to my wife. And I go outside and she's gardening, and I say, hey, Brittany, if this pain is still here tomorrow, I'm gonna go to. And then it was so painful that I cowered over. I couldn't even talk for like 5 seconds. And I was like, yeah, if that pain continues again, I'm gonna go to the. And she's like, no, Joe, we're going to the hospital right now. So we go to the emergency room. Long story short, I actually, unknown to me, had a huge tumor, size of a
Wow.
big peach, that was inside my esophagus, and it was growing and spreading. And the initial diagnosis was, Joe, this is not looking good. Basically, get your life in order to be able to not be here soon.
Wow.
Now, here's some of the other stuff that happened. I start looking back and thinking, I felt inspired to come here. So now when I'm not here, my wife will be next to family that can take care of her. 1 month before I had that, I had the strongest impression to double my life insurance. And I doubled it. And I'm thinking, oh, that makes sense why.
Hmm.
Now, fast forward, spoiler alert, I'm still alive. I have a
Yeah.
clean bill of health. But it was those type of things where I didn't have to look back and be like, oh, what if? It was because I followed what I felt was right in the moment and I knew it was the right thing. Well, it turns out I didn't actually have a tumor, but it helped me gain additional understanding and appreciation for life and what I can be doing and giving and completely changed the way that I viewed life. Well, fast forward, I'm now going through, and I have a teenage daughter at the time. And I won't be too graphic, but we had a really, really tough several weeks. Her best friend died by suicide,
Hmm.
and it was something that was absolutely devastating to our whole family. And she was really struggling. Well, luckily, I was there to be able to help her and care for her and do all the different stuff. Now, at that time, you could look back and be like, well, why was I feeling inspired to come here? This has been terrible. Her best friend died by suicide. And then 2 weeks later, the one person in our community that my daughter really bonded with, she was the sweetest lady. She really helped my daughter through a lot of hard stuff. Well, unfortunately, she died by a murder suicide right across the street from. These are our friends that we played softball
My
with.
gosh.
And I'm thinking I had to actually come home and when the ambulance was there, I had to get my daughter quickly out because it was so traumatic to hear sirens again and see the yellow tape. And now, if I had been thinking, wait, I wasn't inspired to come here in the beginning, I would look back and be like, why did Heavenly Father do this? Why does God, similar to what my daughter was saying, why is this part of his plan? But because I knew it was inspired by him, I didn't even have to go there. I knew that I don't have to have trust that the outcome will be what I want it to be. I have trust that he knows more than I do, and I'm willing to go through this process.
Hmm.
And I look back and I can say, my entire life from that time forward is I will do whatever I feel is right. And I know despite the outcome, I'm going to continue to have faith.
Yeah, that's amazing. And thank you for being willing to share, sometimes those sincere stories that from family and oh, I'm glad you're still here. Glad that ended
Thank
up
you.
good for you and your family. And I think it is a question we don't talk about enough, but how faith in whatever it is, whether that's, whatever your belief system is, your theology is, your religion is, being taking away the outcome, again, bringing it back to what you said before, disassociating from the outcome and more of the process. And with your faith, you can trust that process. I used to always say that playing basketball in high school, trust the process. We're
Yeah.
going to get there. And so thank you again for being willing to share that. That's amazing.
My pleasure. And it doesn't have to be that grandiose of a thing. It could be the simple things where you feel inspired to do a small thing. The other
Hmm.
night, it was midnight. I'm driving along the freeway and there's like a sketchy van with fogged up windows. Remember, it's like midnight
Right.
and pulled off on the side of the street. And I had the prompting, the feeling, hey, you should stop and help. And my logical body mind was like, no, I'm
Mhm.
not going to stop it. I've watched those murder shows, and every
Right.
murder show I've ever watched ends in murder. I'm not going to
Yeah.
go. In fact, this was just the week before there actually was a hostage on that same freeway. And I live in Utah. It seems like a safe
Yeah.
place. It was right there on that same freeway. And I'm like, no. So I
Oh
keep
my gosh.
driving. The feeling kept coming. Joe, turn around and go help him. Finally, remember, go back to faith of, hey, it wasn't necessarily something that I heard as more than I felt, but it was so strong that I said, I'm going to be the type of person when I feel a prompting, I'm going to act. So I turn around on the freeway, go back, and I have my son, he was in the car, and I said, FaceTime me because in case something happens, I need you to call 911.
Yeah.
We get safety. Well, I go in and here's this woman that doesn't speak any English. She was visiting from Peru. Her car ran out of gas, her phone went out of battery, and she's just sitting in this cold car crying because she doesn't know what to do in a foreign land. And here this foreign white guy walks up and she's probably scared. And I was able to communicate because luckily I have some very small language capabilities, but I speak Portuguese and French. And so we were able to somewhat get Spanish enough.
Nice.
And basically, we were able to help her. And I remember driving home that day thinking, man, if I didn't follow that prompting, she could still be there right now. Going
Right.
back to faith of it's following those little promptings despite the outcome, because you know it's part of this process of becoming that really matters.
Yeah. That's amazing. And again, thank you for being willing to share that. I think as a leader, sometimes we think, oh, maybe the leader is the loudest in the room or the most outgoing or the person who has all the answers. But really, it's just the person that has the trust to continue to move forward and ultimately comes back to people in those relationships. Are you willing to serve and do what it takes to serve those people around you? Because, like I said, leadership isn't always about position. It's more about the influence and the relationships and the people that you have
100%.
the responsibility to serve. So thank you for sharing that. And Joe, thank you again. That was my final question I wanted to hear from you. I just want to say thank you so much, how much I enjoyed your stories and your principles of leadership, and thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, thank you for letting me have the opportunity to reflect on these awesome questions because it was just as beneficial for me to think about it as it was hopefully for one or any of the other people that maybe like peaches. So thank you. I appreciate it, Dennis.
Thanks, Joe.
Cheers.
Thank you for spending time with us on the Front Lines of Leadership podcast. Leadership isn't about the position you hold, it's about the responsibility you accept and the people you serve. Take a moment to reflect on one principle from today's conversation that you can apply immediately, at work, at home, or in your community. Small, intentional actions compound into real leadership. Subscribe, share, and join us again as we continue to learn from leaders who show us what it means to lead from the front lines.